So before, I was asked to actually explain what information operations and information warfare is before we get started. So information operations could be seen as a communications campaign if you're in the private sector, if you're doing marketing. Information warfare is basically, it could be a competition between bots that are online, between one party and then the other. Both could be state actors, both could be non-state actors. Typically, information warfare is seen as a part of the kinetic warfare, and if you're doing a lot of stuff against Russia, it's a part of the hybrid warfare, the non-linear warfare that the Russian foreign minister really likes to talk about. Cool. So information warfare basically exploits cognitive insecurity, right? So we all know what physical security is. It's protecting ourselves physically. Cognitive security is how do you actually protect our minds? So cognitive insecurity is basically when there are flaws in our own cognitive security. So it typically exists due to carelessness, just not even caring. Could be also that someone's naive, they're innocent. It could be that they have a target identity weakness, which basically means that they're so loyal to one identity that they become blind to the flaws. And so you see this a lot with ISIS, with Al-Qaeda groups. And then there's also groupthink. On average, when we're in a group together like this, your IQ drops by about 20 points than if you were by yourself. And so if everyone around you, if 40% of people around you will nod yes to an answer that you know is actually wrong, most likely you're either not going to speak or you're also going to go yes, because everyone around you is doing the same thing, right? And then there are also biological neuroscience. I'm not going to get into it, but if you want to talk about it, there are specific hormones that are at work that are created when a consensus where an echo chamber actually occurs. And then there are also the psychological or the emotional imbalance. All right. Actually, okay. So when it comes to comms campaigns, that's basically an information operation. There are really 3 stages, right? One is you're basically tracking and monitoring the adversarial propaganda and their IO campaign. So you're looking at who they're targeting, how they're targeting them, and the results. The second is you want to plan your own counter IO campaign or your own offensive IO campaign. Basically, you look at the same thing, the who, the what, the how, right? And then the third is you want to monitor the effectiveness. And the entire time, you should be monitoring the effectiveness, and we're going to come back to this later. And so to give you a good example of the I.O., the reason why I asked about Harry Potter is because, so this is Lord Voldemort, by the way. This is when he was a kid, and that's when he actually becomes Lord Voldemort. So I want to actually read you an I.O. campaign. Okay, so we all know in the original story, that Harry Potter is the good guy. I'm going to read you this version. So Harry Potter was mistreated and physically and psychologically abused as an orphan. His parents were killed and he never got the closure that he wanted. In school, he was further tormented and bullied by his fellow students, and even his teachers singled him out and treated him unfairly. So he began taking matters in his own hand. He began working out and taking extra classes to improve his skills. He also radicalized those closest to him. He spread his propaganda in person, and through innovative ways like the coin, he continued to do that. He also stole, lied, beat people up, and jinxed them with magic. With sufficient support, he formed a mighty militia against the Ministry of Magic. And he, the non-state actor, won. Same story, right? So my background is actually in countering violent extremism, so I find this really interesting as a radicalization method. But that is an I.O. campaign. And I can see that some of you are nodding, while some others are very skeptical of what I just said. But this is sort of the level of skepticism that you have to get over, because when you grow up with my version of the story, this is what you're going to believe. Right? And you're like, well, really? Like, how can he be the good guy? Right? And so that's where the cognitive insecurity, it's very nebulous, and at the same time, it's very hard to single out just one indicator. And so let's just apply that I.O. campaign that I just mentioned, right, to the 3 stages. I'm going to go through this very quickly. You'll get the slides later, so don't worry about reading what's up here. So the macro strategy level is always about the ultimate goals, and then the type of content, and who you're trying to influence, and how are you going to do it. Is it social media? Is it offline? Is it a hybrid of both? And then your second stage is basically the planning and the execution, right? You want your comeback. And so it's basically the same thing that you're looking for, right? So you want to know your goals, and I want to talk about the basic goals of information warfare. So the ultimate goal is to beat your adversary, right? It's pretty simple. But there are really 4 ways you can do it. You can control the content and how it spreads. So this could be censorship. There are where you could do official channels for manipulation, which is basically, you can think of RT as a good example. And certain content that is organically or inorganically promoted, so that's a distraction, right? So one of the best cases I've ever heard is when Prince, is it Harry who's getting married to Meghan to Meghan Markle? Okay, so when that story became the news, right? Guess which story got bumped down? Theresa May and her inability to deliver Brexit, right? And the joke among this IO community was that that was a perfect distraction piece, because everyone was like, oh my gosh, they're getting married, this is great, like she's half black, this is wonderful, black people can be princesses, you know, like all that stuff. And there was a rumor that within the Prime Minister's office, someone literally said, oh, thank God that news story came out, because now we don't have to talk about Theresa May's unpopularity, right? And then the fourth is basically disinformation and misinformation, which all the other panels have talked about. So once you have your goal, you can now look at how to do it. Oh shit, how to do it, and then you also want to monitor the effectiveness. And so that brings us to the third, is MOE and MOP, which is the lingo that I'm going to use. So when you're monitoring the evaluation, nobody really does it. Nobody really knows how. We've literally spent billions of dollars, right, doing IO campaigns, and we don't really know how effective they are. And a big part is it's really hard to measure the lack of something. But second is also, how do you make sure that something like click-through rate, where the very surface social media metrics like engagements, likes, shares, how do they actually convert into behavioral change or a change in attitudes? And so this is where I feel like the space is lacking, and something that big data can actually help us tremendously with. Because if I were Expedia, or if I were Google Advertising and my client's Expedia, and they're paying me a lot of money to run their advertising, if I go in there with a click-through rate, I will literally be laughed out of the room, because the private sector is a lot more rigorous with their metric. I will have to have the lifetime value over customer acquisition, right, to continue to have them as a client. But for some reason, in this military, in this defense space, we're totally fine with the click-through rate, but what does that actually mean? And so a few other things I do want to touch on this is, the first is a lot of us do surveys. They're great, but they're also very forced and inorganic. And so I was de-radicalizing neo-Nazis up in the Scandinavia region, and I just remember that when we had to go and apply for funding, you know, we would go to the people that we were working with, and we would literally ask them, are you more likely or less likely to re-become a neo-Nazi, right? No one's going to be like, yes, I would like to continue to be a neo-Nazi, unless they're, you know, firmly loyal to the cause, right? And so it's like, well, okay, well, how do we actually know that we did our job? We don't really know. The second is hard to read people's minds, and then there are missed trends due to our brain's limited capacity to compute data sets, right? And that's why we need big data. So big data, essentially what people are posting publicly at their volition, which means that it's more organic. You can also look at how their online behaviors have actually changed based on the way that they engage with different posts. And then the monitoring should also be done with more of a scientific methodology with A/B split tests, or if you're into stats, you can use the multi-arm bandits. And then the third is, big data allows us to look at data points at a community, city, and et cetera levels, right, beyond just the individual levels. So I'm going to run you through an IO campaign we actually did against Jaish al-Islam. So Jaish al-Islam recently became more popular, but they're a Salafist group. They have not been branded as a terrorist group, but they do want Sharia law, and they're in Syria. They used to be the rebels that hold East Ghouta. Now they've been drastically weakened by the Assad regime. So this is Jaish al-Islam. So we decided to look at their influence first, right? Because the first stage is you got to look at your competitors. So they're competing against the Free Syrian Army, Anwar al-Sham, and then Hatash, ISIL, and then there's Jaish al-Islam. So you can tell that Jaish al-Islam, which is the purple line, they have actually steadily increased their influence because social media platforms, I know there are people from Twitter and Facebook here, they don't really know much about this group. So their stuff is still out there, right? They actually have 28 Twitter accounts in 28 different languages, and they're the official channels. And so we said, okay, we want to do an IO campaign to persuade people to not support Jaish al-Islam. So we're going to do an A-B split test. The A is going to be your controlled, right? And your B is going to be your experimental. So we create this narrative, and then we send them out. Because this was just a test, right? We wanted to make sure that we're reaching people with the influence score of around, I think, 50 to 70. Because once you get above 70 to 100, those are the tier 1, and you don't want to send them stuff unless you're positively sure that your narrative actually works. So we did the A-B split test automatically. So this was done actually using machine learning. And then we waited. 2 weeks later, we saw this. So the Jaish followers so your control group are in the red, and then your experimental are in the blue. Wait, actually, sorry, it's flipped. I apologize. So the blue is your controlled, and then your red is the experimental. And so we can see that it kind of fluctuates, right? And this is really important because, so when we first did our pilot in Bosnia, we did it at a very untimely, we had a very untimely timing, which was that it was during Eid, and then it was also the siege of Aleppo. So everyone's radicalization score went straight up. And so we decided, okay, well, we need to actually control for these real events that are happening that might actually skew the data. So this is what you saw, and at the end, you can actually see that the radical posts that people have been engaging with actually dropped. So using machine learning, we basically created something called the radical post. And so it's basically, we can gather all of everyone's activity, publicly available activities, and then start to see, okay, they're actually starting to engage less with radical posts. So this is based on the number of radical posts, and then we can look at the percentage of radical posts. And you can see that there's a huge drop in the experimental. And then finally, something called the radicalization score, which we created from ML, which basically shows the likelihood that someone's online behaviors match the online behaviors of previously known violent extremists. And that went down. So tech has basically made information warfare asymmetrical. There's a big war for data, so raw data, as well as the analysis. But I actually want to make a controversial statement, which is that at this point, it's not really about how much raw data you can get. I think right now the war is on the analysis. If you're the NSA, you're sitting on trillions of data points. It doesn't matter, if you have them. If you don't do the proper analysis on them, they're useless. Right? And then also understanding and using new tech experiments. I'm going to skip that part. And then so this is basically the conclusion. It's a very happy conclusion. That information warfare is more dangerous than the arms race because there's no mutually assured destruction, right? So there's nothing to stop us from having a bot war with Russia right now. The entire internet could be flooded with bots, and we still have to use the internet until quantum internet becomes a thing in like 10 years. And just to end, at the CIA recently has a new director who has made statements supporting torture. And one of the things that we always talk about is that psychological torture, more people prefer physical torture over psychological torture, which makes this statement all the more dire. I'm done.
Thank you, Evanna.